going to be discussing about Maria Diokno's essay, Benevolent Assimilation in Philippine Responses. This essay by Diokno is part of a compilation in a book called Mixed Blessing, The Impact of American Colonial Existence on Politics and Society in the Philippines, edited by Hazel McPherson and published by Greenwood Press, based in Connecticut, America. Now, hold on to that irony, because that's going to be the kind of irony we need to understand in order to understand this essay. By the way, we're going to go about this by talking about different parts of the essay, all of which will be in sequential order. Now, for the sake of argument, and to some extent political correctness, maybe we're not going to talk much about the author so much as we're going to talk about the essay and try to put it in today's context. But we're not going so far as to say, for example, that the work reads like a Marxist analysis of this rather dark chapter of Philippine history, because that would be something up for debate entirely. Also, we're not trying to bombard with information since, well, you probably forget about everything we said once you've left the room. Instead, we're going to look at what the author has to say about this period in our history, how this transition led us into a chain of events that was once new so many years ago that we study now. This also begs one of the questions we've been meaning to ask for a long time. Is the flow of politics we have here with us today new, or is it a pattern manifested constantly throughout history? And I said how because as per what was discussed last time in class, we as an archipelago were eventually sold out of the United States, along with other Spanish colonies like Guam, for example, for $20 million US. As one writer put it, the United States unwittingly bought with it a $200 million war. And for all it's worth and for what it all cost us, this is that part in Philippine history that's blurry to the minds of the average bystander. And the reasons why are still being debated today. Some say it's a natural response, that after all it's a really traumatic event which maybe should be forgotten. Some say that it's been purposefully censored. Others say that it's the result of students not taking history class seriously at all. In this relatively short span of occupation, there are a lot less notable wars and revolutions, and a lot more names and dates and laws enacted that, of course, nobody bothers to remember after passing their blue books. Alright, I've said enough. Cue the intro.
So you will no doubt remember how in the last reporting, the Principalia, or the Philippine elite, were the one most able to jump ship and switch sides depending on whose side is winning. And they were mostly motivated by whether or not they can continue to stay rich and make money. And of course, someone has to pay the price for it all. But strangely, what Diokno argues in this essay isn't really all that black and white as we imagine it to be. What we do remember mostly about the American occupation shortly after Aguinaldo declared independence in his ancestral home is that it was sort of a mixed blessing, as Diokno put it. The first important date to take note at the start of the 20th century is December 21, 1898, when the U.S. President of the time, William McKinley, declared the benevolent assimilation of the Philippines. That's a funny thing to say since the occupation was anything but benevolent. The $200 million war mentioned earlier still haunts us in more ways than just our history books. But we also have to take note of how they tried to justify their occupation, benevolent assimilation. At this point, we all know that it's still the same thing, except under a different name. But this is because it's mostly due to a need to appease the American citizens themselves. You'll no doubt remember, if you briefly check your world history, that America was once a colony herself. The benevolent assimilation thing was packaged in a way that the American people would be able to swallow and gloss over, which works even better when coupled with the idea of the Filipino being portrayed to the American as the other. It was a clear statement of colonial intent, and I quote, "to come not as invaders or conquerors, but as friends, to protect the natives in their homes, in their employments, and in their personal and religious rights." In essence, according to Diokno, it gave the intended irony, which gave this period in Philippine history a distinct image: colonialism with a heart. And of course, we Filipinos bought it. How could we? After facing 330 years under oppressive Spanish rule, refused these new rulers who assured us that we would be granted the full measure of individual rights and liberties, which is the heritage of free peoples? But along with this promise came the order to extend military control over the entire country in order to fulfill the rights of American sovereignty. Of course, those who had lots of money, the Philippine elite, welcomed American sovereignty and were rewarded with protection, while the revolutionaries and their supporters did not. In turn, the hand that America extended in the name of friendship became stained with the blood of the latter in a brutal two-year war, the first one for national liberation in Asia. And this paradox didn't go unnoticed. It was clear in the ways the colonial government took to establish itself on Philippine soil. Take for instance the aptly named Filipinization. In 1901, the municipal and provincial codes were enacted, allowing Filipinos who could read, speak, and write in English or Spanish, and owned real estate and or paid a large amount in annual taxes to vote. In 1903, less than 3% of these people were qualified to vote in the first municipal elections. In terms of administration, they only managed to occupy the minor positions of local government, and even then the Americans outnumbered them. But before you could smell deja vu, take note that before the first decade of American rule closed, the colonial government opened the doors of legislature to Filipinos, eventually retaining key areas such as education and national defense, as one by one they handed the rest of the executive branch to the Filipinos elite. Okay, now that smells like deja vu. Of course, this is only one aspect in the Americans' conquest. The more interesting side of the coin was the quelling of the revolutionary movement, members and sympathizers alike. The first step was by dealing with these prominent personages in Philippine history, such as Apolinario Mabini, Artemio Ricarte, and Pablo Ocampo, who were deported in the earliest years of American rule. In 1901, the same year local elections were finally allowed by law, came the Sedition Act, punishing any form of advocacy of independence with death or long imprisonment. And if that's not enough, there's also the Brigandage Law, under which revolutionaries were driven from their bases of support by the official reconcentration of barrio residents and settlements away from their farms. Also, no one could display any symbol in any way related to the revolution, and the press was censored. There was also one political party allowed at the start of American rule, the Federal Party, which, being a counter-revolutionary one, was co-founded by Americans and members of the Filipino elite, some of whom had been leaders of the revolution they were now suppressing. All this contradiction had been planned at the very start of the occupation. On one hand, there were the rich and literate, who were granted limited freedom but did not voice their desire to be free. And on the other, there were the poor and illiterate, the revolutionaries who were being treated as bandits by the state. This mechanism was foolproof and owed its foolproofness mostly to the laws addressed to each social class, and that these measures never came into contact with each other.
So there's the full measure of individual rights and liberties for you. It's important to note that in this chapter of the Philippine history, conflict and revolution took place not as much on the theater of war as it did on the theater of politics and bureaucracy, which was a huge game changer since it was because of that conflict that allowed us to produce some of the most prominent intellectuals during the occupation. Take for example Apolinario Mabini. But one of the highlights that the average Filipino tends to forget was the portrayal of the Filipino in American print media. This is where the logic of the benevolent conquest really starts to set in. The turn of the century oxymoron became justified because of how the Americans were able to wrap the depiction of Filipinos both in words and in caricature. Take for example editorial cartoons. The Filipino was presented to the American citizens not as our Indian of the North, but instead as an unruly child who resorted to mischievous antics. So, American military officials were prepared to accept that force alone would not bring them long-term results. Because of this, American military policy shifted to avoiding the arousal of race hatred, and according to General Bell, calculated to print the breath of undying resentment and hatred. So how did it fare? Well, Jokno notes an article in Filipinas Anti-Europa, the Filipino committee newspaper in Madrid, that argued how the Filipinos struggled in defense of their ideals of independence and conserve their race, whereas the Americans waged war for profit and exterminate all that was not Anglo-Saxon. The conceited imperialists killed the Filipinos out of hatred and for sport, while the Filipinos killed Americans defending their life and country. And General Bell even admits later on that the policy shifting had failed to arouse sufficient appreciation to affect the common bystanders about the revolutionaries' action. And I quote, "Necessity has been plainly seen for some time for measures better calculated to restrain and put an end to the operations of this portion of the population." So because of the contradictory nature of the benevolent conquest, Filipino sentiment in terms of policy choice became divided into options that were determined largely by their actions to American rule, which in turn was based largely by class. Oftentimes, they appeared in colonial documents as descriptions of the wealthy and educated, in contrast to the poor and ignorant masses. At one end of the spectrum was the unequivocal and unnegotiable goal of the revolution, which was independence, which, from its perspective, was the only true foundation of peace in the country. At the other end of the spectrum, the American colony of the Philippines, complete with full civil and military control over the archipelago, while giving the people an enlightened rule in contrast to the Spanish regime. In 1898, Aguinaldo addressed the privileged Filipinos in the founding Congress in Malolos, Bulacan to be one with the revolution, calling them patriots in words only, and likening them to the annexationists, as he believed that such divisions were bringing the nation harm. But at the same time, he warned them not to preempt the government by seeking either autonomy under U.S. rule or annexation. Instead, he asked them simply to let the people decide, and meanwhile to rid ourselves of the pride and favoritism and disunity the Spaniards had taught them, and by proxy, us.
And of course, because of this, revolutionary literature became rife with titles that reflect varying degrees of Filipino sentiment towards American rule. We have annexionistas, autonomistas, even labels like pseudo-nationalist and true nationalist, just to name a few. On the one side, there were the revolutionaries who wanted complete independence and rejected the idea of local autonomy and annexation. On the other, there was the United States, who was not content even with a compromise, no matter what the previous Pedro Paterno and his friends tried to come up with. One of these, of course, was the attempt to turn the Philippines into an independent protectorate, whose provisions included the granting of amnesty for all prisoners of war, integration of Filipino soldiers into the new army to be formed, and even free exercise of individual human rights as provided for by the U.S. Constitution, the establishment of a local government, and the expulsion of religious orders. And neither side bought it. The U.S. stand was that the islands were their territory by virtue of the Treaty of Paris. Then, President William Howard Taft maintained that it was the U.S. that was bound to establish law and order in the Philippines, and refused to discuss any of it with them, while the revolutionary stand was that Paterno and his friends were simply going to use that for furthering their own personal and political agenda. So I guess sometimes you just can't have everything. So this is a kind of standoff between ideas with regards to American rule in the Philippines, mostly influenced by social class. We can get a clear idea on who the Independistas are, but who exactly were the Americanistas? Editor of Filipino Anti-Madrid and head of the Filipino Committee in Madrid, Isabel de los Reyes, described them being Filipino brothers, some of which he knew personally. They were either professionals or owners receiving small rents and were more or less used to small comforts in life. A number of them had even accepted positions in the local government and resided in Manila, under the bayonets of General Otis, so to speak. De los Reyes understood their fear. Though their actions were morally questionable, he recognized the need for them to earn a living. In his article Olive Branch, he asked that these people conduct themselves with honor in the discharge of their duties as functionaries of the Americans. But at the same time, he firmly reiterated that the same measure of understanding be given to those people who were still, at that time, fighting for independence, risking their lives and everything they had. So one of the reasons that riled the revolutionaries the most was that they could not win the war. The Americans had rightfully obtained sovereignty via the Treaty of Paris, while backed up by their own Congress. So there was basically nothing they could do. Said one, "Glory will never be of the cowards or of the turncoats, but of the men of faith." While General Hughes noted on the one hand how the revolutionaries would continue to wage war despite the efforts of the home authorities to get them to stop fighting what they came to see from their side as a useless struggle, and so were accused of being warmongers, Mabini explained that the revolutionaries were not the enemies of peace nor wanted to wage war in the first place. It was just that to not fight at the time was to accept the shackles that bound them to their colonial master, which was something they as people wouldn't swallow. The revolutionaries meanwhile asserted that genuine peace could not be obtained without war, and peace would be its legitimate outcome. And so in the eyes of the revolutionaries, the autonomistas were simply afraid of losing their witches despite their public claim to patriotism. As one paper put it, there was more to fear from the Filipino-Americanistas than from the Americans themselves, for one was a stranger to their home while the other lived among them.
And to some extent, the revolutionaries were right. The kind of leadership within autonomistas clearly crippled their cause, as most of the time, the leaders were being constantly questioned for their actions and personal motives. Take, for example, Paterno and his friends, who swore an oath of allegiance to the United States. In their attempt to retreat from their position, they reasoned that the oath they swore was not morally binding anyway, with the reasoning that it violated the honor of the Filipino people and nation. But soon afterward, they clarified that the oath was not even of loyalty at all, but of alliance, implying that it was not at all that objectionable. This instance alone says a lot about the behavior of Filipino Principalia at the time, which in turn could explain the behavior of several politicians that made news in contemporary Philippine history today. And yes, Juan Ponce Enrile wasn't the first to think of this ingenious solution of saving one's own skin. And from the revolutionary standpoint, this was proof of bad faith. Moreover, Paterno and his friends were seen as traitors because they were willing to accept autonomy without any assurance of independence or when it would come. In the year of never, as one had put it. Jokno in this essay even goes so far to continue quoting the same writer who asked what kind of Filipino would accept that kind of deception unless they were Amerikain. One theory to support the assumption that these people don't love their country is supported by how their lineages as Filipinos are in themselves doubtful at best. And at least in this kind of distrust towards these kinds of people, the revolutionaries weren't alone. In the 1890s, an American observer described Paterno as a man who lived an extravagant life trying to be a social climber, and I quote, who had been ambitious to pose as the poet and historian of a fictitious Arcadia among primitive Filipinos, who had gratified to the full his love for notoriety in acting as arbitrator between the Spaniards and revolutionists in 1897, only to meet with the cold and cruel disregard of Primo de Rivera when he asked for the title and prerequisites of a Spanish grandee for the first class. This was a man ready for reconciliation schemes of any sort, or to speak more accurately, for notoriety of any sort. In contrast, the same observer noted Mabini as being open and irreconcilable, so rare among those living in the towns, either in freedom or in confinement, as to make him virtually unique among the revolutionists for ability, at least in statement, in theoretical if not in practical statesmanship. Yet Mabini's expressions during the period are not only of interest, as the outgivings of a Filipino remarkable in many ways. It is quite safe to assume, as setting forth the opinions of a very considerable element of his fellows more ably, as well as more frankly, than they could set them forth. Mabini's documents were never models of clearness, but such lack of candor as they evince was rather the result of the mental roundaboutness and the delight in mere phrase-making which he had imbibed in the atmosphere in which he has been educated, than of deliberate effort to avoid a full and frank expression of his opinion. End of quote. And at this point, well, we'll leave it at that. In June 1900, General Arthur MacArthur tried to get the revolutionaries out of hiding by offering them amnesty for past actions, except of course for violations of the law of war. But the turnout was missing and only a little more than 5,000 surrendered. As he himself admitted, many of them had no intention of accepting American sovereignty. At the time, the revolution was putting up local governments alongside American established governments, in many cases using the same personnel. On the one hand, these were people openly in favor of the United States, but on the other, clandestinely supported the revolution. And the thing is, these American-occupied towns also served as the base of revolutionary activities and a place of refuge for revolutionists on the run. This led MacArthur to believe that the easy transformation of guerrilla fighters into quiet barrio folk was because the whole indigenous populace was united. But he believed that it wasn't the only factor. Apart from acknowledging fear, believed it was also the ethnic homogeneity of the people. But other Americans' views weren't so forgiving. Some accused the Filipinos of subterfuge. According to the New York Herald, this was especially pointed out at the revolutionaries living within American lines, those who were friends by day and enemies by night, enjoying both the support of the rich and poor Filipinos alike. The whole revolution was insulted by the proclamation of amnesty, which the Americans made clear by offering to pay 30 pesos for every gun surrendered in good condition, considered by many to be a price tag for freedom. One Filipino supporter in Spain came up with a clever idea that his comrades at home sell their antiquated guns and use the money to purchase new ones, concluding that when a country as proud and powerful resorted to such means, it was clear that they were far from winning the war. Essentially, the whole fiasco reduced Filipino options to an either-or situation, with immediate choices seen by each side as favoring the other. And this failed to capture the complexity of the war when choices had to be made. The reason why it seems so black and white to us today was mostly because their places were predetermined since even before the Americans came. To not make a stand, for instance, was already to take the stand of the oppressor. But there was one proposal that was different from the rest. Trinidad Pardo de Tavera, one of the few to raise an argument of modernization as the justification for accepting the Americans. His proposal stood out among all those presented because it offered a different view in a clear manner so as to sway even more the committed advocates of independence or submission. Without even meaning to, he answered MacArthur's criticism that Filipinos were far too occupied with academic discussions of autonomy, annexation, independence, and other abstractions, hardly concerning themselves with the more pragmatic questions relating to the prosperity of the people and the establishment of civil institutions. What we do know about Pardo de Tavera's proposal was that he dealt specifically with the practical need for progression and development. He argued that English language was necessary so that, through its agency, the American spirit may take possession of us, and that we may so adopt its principles, its political customs, and its peculiar civilization that our redemption may be complete and radical. The kind of redemption he's talking about, by the way, was our Spanish colonial past. He argued that the real question before Filipinos was not about sovereignty or independence at all, but in terms of preparing the people so they could not be oppressed by their government, exploited by authorities, and so that they would not look at an elected office as the only thing worth striving for. His ambition was society's transformation, without which, he argued, political change would be fictitious and incapable of subserving the true interests of the people. Ferdinand Blumentritt, a German friend of the revolution, differed from Pardo de Tavera, as explained why in a letter to him in May 1899. If the Filipinos were indeed incapable of self-rule, as Pardo de Tavera believed, then the aspiration for autonomy would be just as futile. On this assumption, the only correct option was to become an American colony, albeit with the few liberties the Spaniards had refused to grant, he wrote. And even then, he argued that self-government wouldn't happen in 100 years. His explanation to this was simple. The United States would never recognize the ability of an inferior race to govern itself. He warned de Tavera that Americans would simply treat the noble sons of the country the way they did their colored gentlemen way back at home. To the Americans, he argued, we would be no better than the nigger. This still rings true today, especially when we look at politics as the manifestation of what kind of society Filipinos have and live in. And we can suffice it to say, it's not a pretty sight.
So what was this all really about? Power play in order to keep the uneducated ignorant and make dictators out of leaders of an independent Filipino nation? Or was it a contest of hubris, a test of endurance between conflicting wills at the expense of countless young lives? These are the questions that Pardo de Tavera raised when he implicitly questioned the premises of the whole revolution. His approach to these questions was to separate political from social transformation, as if these were two processes that could succeed without each other. What good was political transformation without social change? And what good was the latter without the former? From the Katipunan standpoint, political change and social transformation were both part of the same process. One could not happen without the other. When Aguinaldo declared independence from his ancestral home in Kawit, Cavite, he kept referring to the higher order of goodness and reason on which the Philippine Republic was founded. The task of the revolution became to build a nation founded not on blood or insincere acts, but on deed and the individual right of each one. A nation that was without corruption or greed, envy, self-flattery, or boastfulness and degrading prattle. To the revolutionary, the revolution was whole and indivisible. To the Ilustrados, a revolution could be split in parts and achieved in sequence if not a whole. Diokno argues that this kind of compartmentalization is similar to false division pushed by some governments in Asia today, favoring economic development over political rights. In simple terms, the Filipino had to choose. One could only pick one or the other, not both. The question then, Diokno concludes, is not whether one or the other was more important, but whether Filipinos were entitled to both as a single unified option for the future. Pardo de Tavera and his friends chose to adopt Americanization as the path to independence, even though the development agenda was decided by the Americans and not them. On the other hand, the revolution demanded both, the first being an end of itself, and then the second as a means of development. Without both, the revolution preferred to die the glorious death of martyrdom. It was this divergence of perspective that differentiated the elite from the revolutionary and drove a wedge between them. It was also the difference in thinking that explains the conflicting Filipino reactions to benevolent assimilation and mixed blessings it purportedly bestowed. In many ways, it is still this divergence of perspective that differentiates today's moneyed elite from the vast poor majority. We all have a part to play in history. We can only make a significant change if we stop thinking just for ourselves and start thinking about other people too. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week. This episode of All of Us was made possible thanks to these wonderful people. Shoutouts to Kim, Fretzy, and Thor for taking part in this activity. Special thanks also to Sir Jesse for making this possible in the first place. The show was written by me and produced by Ate BJ, and as we say in our hometown, don't forget to be awesome.